Just a few months ago, Justice Scalia was up in Hartford, and I asked him, what is most surprising about the whole same-sex marriage issue? And he says, well, obviously it's surprising that our courts now believe that they can legislate. Obviously, it would be very surprising to our founders that the courts think that they're the ones who now dictate our government. But the most surprising thing is that we, the people, do not rise up and say no. So Scalia himself is saying, why are we so willing to take this? And I think that this is changing, but I think we need to be more confident in forcing this change to occur. So when you talk about this issue, when you ask people about this issue, when people call us and say, what's going on? There's a bit of a sense of just a disconnect. As Professor Haas said, well, how could you do this? This is if you're changing reality. I mean, marriage is fundamentally based upon something. You can't just tomorrow say, well, men are women or women are men. But I think that this division, this disbelief is because there is a whole group of elites who actually do believe that they can change the very meaning of words. They can change the very meaning of reality through their will. And this is not new. We essentially have a Nietzschean class of elites saying, we will make reality what we want it, and we don't care what you think. Now, we're at a point in time that this has happened before. In 1793, many people living in France would have thought, well, you're crazy if you're telling us that in a year they will be killing our priests. They will be telling us that the church has no rights. I mean, there's an understanding that at the time these things were inevitable. People at the time thought, well, things are just going to go on the way they've gone on forever. There was no real sense that the nation was at a state where chaos would ensue. And the reason that all of this occurred is because of ideas. If you tell people, if you train people, if you take elites and tell them for long enough that there is no such thing as a natural law, there is no such thing as a reality beyond us, there is no transcendent order, there is no reality other than what we make, they're going to start acting like it. 2 years at Oxford and a number of years at UCLA and being around university professors and philosophers has taught me one thing, that our kids, our universities are training people to believe that whatever they want reality to be, it will be. And they have the power to make it that way. This is frightening. And I think this issue of same-sex marriage is about much more. It's enough to try and redefine the family. I mean, this strikes at the very heart of our faith and also of our government, but it has much more meaning. And that's why for the last 30 years, proponents of redefining marriage have worked so hard and so vigorously and so smart in what they have done and what they have money and energy, and has been quite successful. Now, am I entirely pessimistic? Of course not. The passage of the state marriage amendments were key, were very important for our side. But I don't think we should be lulled into the idea that because we have 39 states now that define marriage as the union of a man and a woman, that this is a battle that is almost over. I think that is completely wrong. This is a battle that has just begun. Because the gay marriage issue was sort of a phalanx issue. It was a wedge to get all of the rest in. And they have been very smart in pushing public opinion. If they can't get same-sex marriage, then even our own people, even Catholics who, are not just saying they're Catholic, are attending Mass, are saying, well, we've got to give them the same rights and benefits. So even if they don't have the word marriage, we're going to support civil unions. And that's actually what happened in Connecticut. We had a rally where we had 6,000 people at the state capitol. That's what the Capitol Police, said. We had every color, religion. We had the leader of the Orthodox Jewish community in New England speak. We had the Catholic bishops speak. We had black charismatic Pentecostals up there rallying the crowd. It was a great time. We had 100,000 people sign a petition. But in the state of Connecticut, we don't have a process that even Massachusetts has. We have no referenda or initiative process. And the gay lobby knew this. There was no way to directly change what was going on in the legislature. And thus, in 2004, when the rest of the country was moving in one direction, Catholics in Connecticut who self-identify overwhelmingly as Democrats decided to vote in an overwhelmingly Democratic state legislature. These are people who overwhelmingly also say they oppose same-sex marriage, and they tend not to see any division between these two things. They voted them in, and right the day after Election Day, the deal was sealed. We were either going to get civil unions or something like it in that session. They had been working, they had the votes lined up, and to tell you the truth, it was a big victory for us just to have inside that amendment a definition of marriage. And we opposed it. We said, you're giving us the same thing by a different name. But in that bill, they said, well, we're going to, as you said, split the baby. We're going to pass civil unions, but we're going to define marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Elections matter. They'd been working for years. They had it all tied up. And it didn't matter that 6,000 people were out there. If you have no form of redress, this is going to be passed. So they were very astute in the way they went about what they did. And I think we need to learn from what they've done. And we need to do not the same thing, but have the same passion and smarts about what we do. So I want to talk about two things. The question of swaying public opinion, I think, is critical. And the question of political mobilization and what we can do to, as quickly as possible, get to a point where we can be on some sort of grounds to fight. And so on the issue of public opinion, I think we need to, as Catholics, understand that we need to be smart about creating alliances, about how we frame the debate. To just stand up and say, the Catholic Church opposes this, so you should oppose it, is not going to fly. Now, I believe that because I believe in the Catholic Church. But in a society in which you have people who don't accept what we believe, we need to make persuasive arguments that are going to go to the heart of people who believe what we believe. The other side has done this very well. The first, and I think the most important argument we need to continue to hammer, is the fundamental argument that marriage, the union of man and a woman, is something unique because children do best with both moms and dads. It's a very simple argument. We know that this is rooted in natural law. We know that this is rooted in the sacrament of marriage, but we don't need to, we can go to the truth beyond that, the truth that God implanted into us that men and women are different. This is something that seems so simple, but if you argue with proponents of same-sex marriage, they deny it. We're at the point where they are arguing there really is no difference. Kids will do the same with two dads and two moms. In fact, they'll do better. Professor Stacy argues, kids actually end up being better if they have two dads or two moms because they're not so bound by gender. If you think gender is a construct, if you think, we just made gender up, then this is the end point that results. And I think the groups pushing same-sex marriage, they know that this is a strong argument, so they'll try and, when you bring it forward, they'll try and undercut you immediately. They'll say, for example, well, look at our families, and they will use their children as trophies, as props. Look at our children here. We're the same as you. We're a man, and look at our happy kids. And they have really no qualms about bringing their kids up and using them in the argument. And when you're debating, it is not those children's fault that this is going on, but the fact of the matter is that their parents are willfully depriving them of the chance of ever having both a mom and a dad. And we need to be ready to say that. So I think that this argument leads to a second argument. And sometimes people call this the slippery slope argument, but it isn't actually a slippery slope argument. It's a logical argument based upon their definition of what marriage is. The civil rights claim of people who support same-sex marriage is essentially that people who are in love should be able to marry who they want to marry. This is the argument that convinced many of our legislators. Marriage is a civil right, and because I love a man or because I love a woman has no bearing on my right to marry. I have the civil right to marriage. Because they don't see gender as at all important, they're able to make this argument, and they make the argument convincingly to many people. But if you take their logic seriously, if the emotion or experience of love is what defines marriage, if that is the definitional quality of marriage, my emotional feelings for another, then the binary structure of marriage is gone. Why two? The two-ness or the binary structure of marriage is based upon the complementarity of men and women, of the fact that mothers and fathers are different. If you erase that, if you cut that away and you say it's just based on emotion or love, I love 4 people. I love 5 people. It isn't a slippery slope argument. This is true. If you're saying that we're arbitrarily limiting marriage to a man and a woman, and then you say, I want same-sex marriage, but then you say, but not polyamory or polygamy. Aren't you arbitrarily limiting marriage to 2? From where do you get the idea that you have the right to same-sex marriage, but I don't have the right to 3, 4, or 5? I mean, logically, it makes no sense. Once you do away with gender, once you do away with the fact that men and women are different, it's over for marriage. Marriage ceases to exist as any sort of a meaningful and shared a good.
These people don't think there's any difference between men and apes either, right?
Well, this brings us to the third point, and I think Maggie, who's here, has done a great job on the third point that I want to bring up that I think does sway public opinion in our direction. And I don't think that we did early on. I don't think that those of us defending marriage nationwide did enough about highlighting what I think is one of the worst implications of same-sex marriage, and I think that the proponents of same-sex marriage know it, and that's the attack on religious liberty. The Banned in Boston article and all of the stuff that you've done, Maggie, has been just great. In fact, we took the Banned in Boston article that Maggie Gallagher wrote, and we mailed it to every single legislator and every single candidate for office to show them, you think that this is an issue about civil rights. Well, look what's happening in Boston. Now, if you truly believe that there is a civil right to same-sex marriage, if you truly believe that sexual orientation is identical to race, isn't the next logical step to say people shouldn't be able to discriminate? If you believe, for example, that it is exactly equivalent to say men and men should marry, and that if you're stopping them from marrying, you're being a bigot to races, well, shouldn't we say, well, you're not allowed to do this? Shouldn't the government say, well, you're not allowed to do this? And this is already happening. For example, in Boston, Catholic Charities, who were taking care of the adoptions of the most difficult kids that you can adopt, older kids that had problems, the church said, well, we're not going to do state adoptions to same-sex couples. We can't. Now, what do you think a state that has passed same-sex marriage is going to say? You are discriminating. You're not allowed to do this. So what happens? Well, thankfully, but also sadly, the church stood up and said, no, we can't do this. So now we're out of the adoption business. What happens to those kids? Now, who's going to take care and fill the void of the Catholic Church? This is but one example. In Canada, a famous case where the Knights of Columbus did not want to rent their hall to a same-sex a party after a same-sex wedding. They were fined. The Brocky case, where a printer refused to print the letterhead of a gay and lesbian organization, fined. This is happening all over the place. In Connecticut, after passage of civil unions, they wanted to not create an uproar. They're scared of an uproar. So there weren't a lot of lawsuits, but not everyone follows the party line. So a doctor at St. Mary's Hospital who had a same-sex partner in a civil union files a complaint against St. Mary's Hospital and therefore a complaint against the Catholic Church. Why? The Catholic Church no longer has any right to say that we do not have a civil union. Their claim is that the Catholic Church must recognize their civil union because the state does, and therefore the Catholic Church must give them the same benefits that they would to married couples. In this way, you've just destroyed religious liberty. The implications for this are profound. This is just the beginning. You're going to have all sorts of conflicts that we can't even envision on how the state is going to relate to the church when the church defines it as defines marriage as one thing, but the state defines it as another. I mean, some have argued that we were talking about this earlier. You get the state out of the marriage business completely. Like France, you get married in a church, and then you'll have to go and get a civil marriage also. This is just the tip of the iceberg, what's gone on. And I think that the public understands this. We did a poll in Connecticut where many people, the issue and the language that they were most frightened about, the whole same-sex marriage issue, was the question of religious liberty. What happens to the churches? And I think we need to continue to talk about that and highlight any cases where this comes up. I think people start to understand what's at stake. Finally, and I think this is something that is an issue that, again, in this election, and I think in general, we have just started to really let people understand, is the fact that this is profoundly anti-democratic. The movement for same-sex marriage is going through the courts. We all know this. But even when we do what's right, even when we go through the proper process, as in Massachusetts, legislators are saying, well, the Constitution says that we're supposed to have a vote, but we decide to convene. What are you going to do about it? People don't like to be disconnected from their government in this way. And we need to highlight again and again and again that this is what we're up against. We're up against not only a judiciary that's out of control, but even our legislators, the people that we elect, are going against their own constitution. I mean, this is not what a republic is about. We need to stand up and we need to be able to argue and we need to get upset and outraged and be willing to act. We need people up in Boston. We need big rallies. We need to do what they've been doing. They can motivate their people like this. And that brings me to the second large issue. Swaying public opinion is only one thing. We can have all the public opinion on our side that we want, but if we aren't ready to politically mobilize, if we're not smart about electing people that represent our values, it doesn't matter. That's what happened in Connecticut. Ironically, it's in the states that have the highest Catholic populations that we're seeing the most serious attacks upon marriage. This is the great irony, is that Massachusetts and Connecticut, states that have very high Catholic, quote-unquote, populations, and I understand that there are people who say they're Catholic and don't go to Mass. I understand all of this, but it's in states where evangelical Protestantism is dominant, where you're seeing really effective campaigns to stop same-sex marriage. There are a lot of different reasons for this, but this is ironic. And as Catholics, this should trouble us. So when it comes to political mobilization, we have to be smart, as the other side has been smart. One thing we need to do is we need to first build broad coalitions. Our coalitions need to be as broad as possible. Just because people aren't Catholic doesn't mean that they don't want to defend marriage. I'm not saying that we're going to change what we believe, but just as in the pro-life battle, we need to work together with everyone who's going to fight alongside us if our objective is to defend marriage. In Connecticut, some of the leading Black and Hispanic ministers have joined up with us and are continuing to fight. The passage of civil unions, I mean, we didn't look up and say, oh, it's all over. We're fighting. We're fighting through the elections. We're fighting in every way we can. We're fighting for a constitutional convention. And a lot of the power behind what we do is is from these black and Hispanic ministers who can stand up and say, you claim this is an issue of civil rights. You know, my ancestors were slaves. Don't use me as an example to push something that is not a civil right at all. That is very persuasive. We can stand up and talk about the fact that logically we don't accept that this is a civil right. I mean, time and time again when reporters ask me, well, so you're against their civil rights? I said, no, I would support same-sex marriage if I thought it was a civil right. There is no civil right to same-sex marriage. You're begging the question. Let's argue about why you think this is a right. But making a rational argument is one thing, and it's important, but we also need to use the power of persuasion. People understand that having a broad coalition is very effective. They understand that the black community is getting very tired of being hitched to the gay marriage wagon. And you'll notice that lately, if you read any of the materials that are being put out by Human Rights Campaign or any of these the big gay marriage lobbies, they've backed off a little bit because they got scared. They got scared in the last election that too many African American and Hispanic ministers were recoiling at their attempt to link them with the gay marriage issue. So I say that we need to try and build broad coalitions with as many people as possible in fighting this fight. Secondly, and this may seem like a paradox, is that we need more than one group doing this. We shouldn't say our way or the highway. For example, the Family Institute, we don't talk about, we're not up there talking about sodomy all the time. We're not talking about homosexuality, but groups that do, please do. I wish Catholic priests were preaching from the pulpit what the church teaches. But that isn't our role. So we're trying to fulfill one role, and just like the other side has different groups doing different things. They have their very extreme groups that are pushing, saying nothing but same-sex marriage. We're not going to capitulate on anything. They have groups that are appearing more moderate that are saying, okay, we will accept civil unions. And they're advancing their agenda because people say, well, this extreme group, we don't like them, but you know, this has become the moderate center of opinion. They've been very effective in pushing people to say, well, I don't want to seem like I'm an extremist, so civil unions. And that's really what happened in Connecticut. So we need to have more groups of people getting together, Catholic groups, Protestant groups, but each doing their own thing and being willing to step up and speak on this. Third, and this is pretty simple, but I think it's one of the hardest things to do, is Pope John Paul II said, be not afraid. How many Catholics aren't afraid? We are so afraid of this issue. Maybe not people here, but in general, I'll talk to priests who call me, well, I want to talk about this, but we have a family with a gay child here, and I don't really want to talk about the issue at all. Well, being loving is preaching the truth. Being loving is being willing to stand up and say, right is right, wrong is wrong. I'm not saying to have any sort of invective or hate, but stand up, speak the truth, and don't be worried about the consequences. What can they do to us? My wife despises public debate. She turns on the television and says, couldn't you have picked another issue? I mean, you're like the same-sex marriage guy. I said, I don't particularly like talking about this question either, but I think it's so fundamental, it's so important that we have to. I mean, who wants to talk about this issue? I think one of the reasons it's got as far as it's gotten, and not just on the gay marriage issue, the entire agenda, what's going on in our schools. I got a call 5 days ago from a parent, a teacher in 6th grade stood up before his class and said, everyone who supports same-sex marriage get on one side of the room, and everyone who opposes it get on the other side of the room. 2 kids went to one side of the room that said they opposed same-sex marriage. Everyone else went over here. This is in 6th grade. His child was one of the ones who went over here. This should outrage us. So the agenda, I mean, it is not just about sexuality. I mean, of course that's a part of it, but it's about you will believe what we tell you to believe, and you will believe it now. We will use all of the powers that we have to stigmatize you and force you from an early age into accepting what we accept. This is what your kids are up against. I mean, even if you're homeschooling, there is going to be contact. We need to strengthen them and make them understand that, you know, we may not want to talk about this issue, but we're going to have to. It's gotten to a point where you can't just duck your head in the sand. And I think that part of the reason why we're at the point we're at is that very few of us wanted to really address this and talk about it. So we hoped it would just go away. It's not going away. We have to live with that reality. It's not going away. And even if every state passes a state constitutional amendment, it's not going away. It's going to resurface in some other way. It will resurface in what's going on in the schools. I mean, the amount of organization that they have achieved is incredible. So this gets me to the third point on political mobilization. Congressman Marilyn Musgrave and almost everyone that I've spoken with, Sam Brownback, everyone behind this issue laments the fact that supposedly, and when we vote on this issue, we're a majority. But where are the organizations? Where are our political action committees? Where is our funding for good candidates? 4 years ago, we organized a political action committee. When I look back, it amazes me that there was no political action committee in Connecticut focused on our issues before that happened. What is wrong with us? It's like coming into a football game halfway through and expecting to win. I mean, maybe you don't like politics. Well, that's fine. I don't particularly like it either. But if you don't get involved, they're going to keep voting this way. And so what our PAC did was we said, look, we know what the Republicans, many of them in Connecticut, are about. They don't care about our issues. I mean, this is not a party issue. But what we need to do is find people who accept on either sides of the party aisle what we believe. We need to help them. So one of the most surprising things in Connecticut is that our PAC has endorsed a number of Democrats in urban areas for primaries. And what we found is you can have a huge effect on the legislature during primary season if you go into an urban district and you learn politics at the grassroots from people you might not have that much in common with. But I have learned an amazing amount by getting involved at the grassroots in urban areas, and we've had a lot of success in that way, because if you go into downtown Hartford and you go from door to door and you ask people, what do you think about same-sex marriage? They will look at you like you're crazy. This is not even on the radar screen. And so once you start bringing up, well, this is what your legislators are doing, they'll say, well, I'm not voting for a Republican. You know, I will never vote for a Republican. But you know what? If we have a good Democrat, we'll vote for him. And you can get seats this way. This has to be planned out, this has to be organized, and it has to be done in such a way that you're thinking little by little by little, we're going to try and get some sort of a critical mass in our legislature to stop things. In this legislative session, the Democratic wave took out a lot of great legislators around the country in state legislatures. People like us tend to think, well, you know, our answers are at the federal level. You know, we've got to fight it all out there. This is what's most important. It's, a lot of the things that are most going to affect you are happening in your state legislature. And if we organize effectively, it is not that hard to change it. Whereas all of the states around us witnessed some serious losses. And this wasn't just because of us. It was because a lot of pastors were out there preaching on this issue. We only had one incumbent that we lost. And we picked up a seat in our state Senate. Now, would I have liked to pick up more seats? Yeah. But it's a beginning. And that's what we have to view. We have to say, look, we're going to do this. We're going to be involved politically. We're going to learn new things. Because if we don't, talking about the issue with our friends, being willing to stand up, it's all great. But a lot of the nitty-gritty of how these decisions are made are the day after Election Day. It's pretty much done. Lobbying's great, all the other things I believe in, but if we don't get involved in the elections, and if we're not tied completely to one party or the other. In general, the Republicans in Connecticut are better. But we've had some Democrats who will stand up and say things that none of the Republicans will say. And there's a Hispanic Democrat, David Alderondo, who came to our rally and he said, "Have you gone crazy? Has our state gone crazy? Is this what our state thinks I think, or the Hispanic community in my district think?" No. We need people like that. And we need to grow what we're doing in a state-by-state basis. So I think that this is just, I've sketched out a number of thoughts that I think are crucial to catching up. But in all of this, you may not have the best answers. You may not know, the best arguments. But ultimately, we need each and every one of you, each of us, to be willing to not be afraid to stand up and speak on this issue, even when people make you feel as if, you're way out there for believing what you believe. And if we do that, I am hopeful that on the marriage issue we can win. I think that we will see more states like Connecticut, unfortunately. I think those states that don't have referenda, I think you're going to see some sort of an attempt at domestic partnerships, civil unions. But I do think on the question of marriage, it'll be long-term in states like Connecticut that don't have referenda, but I think that we can win.